A certain mafia group is throwing a party in the courtyard of their base. This mobster group is led by an old man named Norm. The party is also attended by a man named Bull, who is none other than Norm's son-in-law. Norm calls Bull and says that they have to get ready to leave because, after the party is over, they will collect a debt from someone. The party is over, Norm, Bull, and his other men immediately rush to leave. Upon arriving at the site, a meat slaughterhouse, Norm confronts the owner. Norm looked upset because the factory owner had been in arrears for a long time. Unwilling to pay off his debt, Norm plans to confiscate the factory, but unfortunately, the factory owner refused to do so, and he also did not want to sign the foreclosure papers, even though initially, he had promised to pay off his debt. The factory owner's behavior makes Bull annoyed, as he is constantly playing them. Bull then proceeds to approach him, and without saying many words, Bull slashes the factory owner's finger. In the end, because of what Bull did to him, the factory owner finally agreed to sign the foreclosure papers. On the way home, Bull asks Norm about Gary, one of his teammates, who didn't join them for this task, knowing that Gary was the one who loaned their money to the factory owner and was supposed to be the one to solve this problem. Hearing Bull's question, no one answered it, neither Norm nor any of his men said anything. Later that evening, when Bull returns home, he sees Gary's car parked in his driveway. Here we find out that, as it turns out, behind his back, Gary has been having an affair with his wife, Gemma. Gemma is startled by Bull's sudden arrival, and without saying anything to her, Bull goes to his son's room. Bull's heart is broken, and he did not expect his wife to betray him and have an affair with Gary, his own friend. Out of respect for Norm, Bull covers up his wife's affair. He doesn't say anything to Norm. In the following days, there is nothing Bull can do but endure all his heartache on his own, and he will just focus on raising his son, Aiden. One day, Norm takes Bull for a chat somewhere. Norm tells Bull that he is the only person he can rely on at work, but because Gemma, his daughter, prefers to live with Gary, Bull has to divorce Gemma. Norm then apologizes to Bull and says that Bull is no longer part of their gang. Bull says that he doesn't care about Gemma and Gary. Bull has known about their affair for a long time, but he chose to keep quiet about it simply because he still respects Norm as the leader of the gang. If it weren't for his respect for Norm, then he would have slaughtered them already. Bull then states that he is ready to leave their gang. However, there is one thing he asks for: custody of Aiden, his son. Norm disagrees with Bull's request. He can't let Aiden live with Bull, as he thinks Bull is incompetent to take care of him. In the end, Bull walks away in a rage. The next day, Bull recklessly takes Aiden to his old home. Despite Bull's brutality in dealing with his opponents, he loves his only son dearly. Later that day, two of Bull's friends, Marco and Mike, come to his old home. They were ordered by Norm to take Bull to a nearby funfair. Bull initially refused the invitation. He no longer wanted to deal with them, but Marco said that Norm just wanted to say goodbye to Bull and Aiden. At that thought, Bull finally agrees to meet with Norm. Arriving at the funfair, Bull enjoys playing with Aiden and riding some of the rides. Sometime after that, he runs into Norm. Norm orders Mike and Marco to take Aiden away with them to the next game while he and Bull are having a little chat. Once Aiden is away, Norm points a gun at Bull, and then he takes Bull to the parking lot. There, Bull finally meets Gary. Full of anger, Bull says that Gary is a loser. Not only that, Bull also says that Gemma is just a cheap woman who cheats on any man. Upon hearing Bull's insults about his daughter, Norm smashes Bull's head with his gun and orders Bull to get into the trunk. They then take Bull to an empty bus in the middle of a field. Soon after, Gemma shows up and beats Bull up for taking Aiden away. When things get calmer, Norm asks Bull, what would he do if he were forced to part with Aiden? Bull casually responds that he will eliminate everyone who did that. At that point, Norm, who knew Bull's ferocity, didn't want to take any chances. In the end, Norm made up his mind to kill Bull. Norm orders his men to prepare some gasoline and pour it all over the bus, while Bull is choked with alcoholic liquor until he passes out. Without any mercy, they leave him alone in the empty bus, then set it on fire with Bull inside. Aiden, who knows that his father is in the bus, gets out of Gemma's car and screams hysterically for his father, and Gemma swiftly takes him back into the car. 10 years after the incident, a man waits for a taxi to pick him up. That man is Bull. He is back, and this time he is determined to take revenge on the people who have betrayed him. After a while, Bull reaches his destination. He then gets out of the car and proceeds to kill a man who used to be Norm's man. After killing the man, Bull heads to the funfair, a place where he and his son, Aiden, once had a lot of fun together. At the funfair, Bull reminisces about the good times with Aiden. The scene then moves to the home of Norm's eldest daughter, Gemma's older sister. The woman looks extremely surprised as soon as she turns on the lights of her house. She sees her husband tied up, and she is even more panicked when she sees Bull standing right in front of her, alive. Bull then asks where Gemma and Norm's new home address is because their old home is no longer inhabited. The eldest daughter claims that she doesn't know it. It's been 5 years since they've communicated with each other. Upon hearing this, without a second thought, Bull kills her and her husband, as it was the two of them who provided the bus where Bull was burned alive by Norm and his men. The next morning, at Gemma and Gary's house, Norm, who now looks older, comes to Gemma and Gary's new home while they are enjoying breakfast. Norm arrives that morning to inform them about the deaths of Gemma's sister and her husband, who were murdered. At that news, Gemma gets angry with Norm. She is sure that the murderer who has killed her sister must be Norm's enemy. Upon his daughter's accusation, Norm then argues that he has no more enemies and, most likely, their deaths were committed by robbers. Bull is again on his revenge spree. This time, he meets a little boy who turns out to be Marco's son, one of Norm's men who betrayed him in the past. Bull tells the boy to go home and tell his father about his arrival, and he says that he will wait for Marco in the park. The boy goes home, and when he arrives, he conveys Bull's message to his father. Marco is shocked when he hears Bull's name. He doesn't believe what his son says. Marco then calls Norm and tells him everything that his son told him, including that a man named Bull came looking for him. Norm then tells Marco to meet the man to confirm whether it is true that the man looking for him is Bull. A few moments later, Marco sets out to meet Bull. Before leaving the house, Marco took a knife and told his wife to lock all the doors. He asked no one to leave the house until he returned. Arriving at the park, Marco was greatly surprised to see Bull, who is still alive. He doesn't seem to believe it because, in the past, he saw Bull being burned in front of his own eyes. Marco then apologizes to Bull for betraying him. Marco says that he was only carrying out Norm's orders. Meanwhile, Marco's wife was frantically waiting to hear from her husband, and a few moments later she got a call from Marco, but when she answered the phone, the one who was talking was not Marco but Bull. Suspecting something might be wrong, Marco's wife headed to the park. When she got there, she was in shock to see that her husband had died in a tragic way. The next morning, Norm and Gary go to Bull's mother's house. The death of Marco a few days ago made them realize that Bull was indeed alive. Norm confronts Bull's mother and asks where Bull is at the moment. However, powerless as she is, she says that she doesn't know where Bull is. All she knows is that he disappeared 10 years ago. Norm continuously presses Bull's mother. He even threatens to kill the old woman if she persists in keeping silent about Bull's whereabouts. A few hours after Gary and Norm left, Bull arrives at his mother's house, and how sad he is to find that his mother has been killed by Norm. Bull's quest for revenge continues. This time his target is Mike. That morning, Mike had just picked up his 2 children from school. As he walks with his 2 children, Bull is waiting for him in a car. Mike looks so shocked when he sees Bull, it's like he's seeing a ghost. As we knew, Mike was also involved in killing Bull with Norm and the others. Bull tells Mike to get into his car, otherwise, he will kill him. Along the way, Mike keeps apologizing and continues to beg Bull for forgiveness. He begs for his 2 children to be spared. Bull then asks Mike about Gemma's whereabouts, but Mike, due to his ignorance, swears that he doesn't know where Gemma is. Mike says that he hasn't seen Gemma in 3 years. Mike then says, maybe Gary and Norm know where Gemma is. In the end, Bull leaves Mike with a choice. If Mike can bring Gary to the fun fair, then he will let Mike and his 2 children go, but if Mike can't bring Gary to him, then he will kill him and his 2 children. Arriving at the amusement park, Bull takes his time to play on one of the rides with Mike's son. A while later, Mike arrives and tells Bull that he managed to contact Gary and that Gary is currently in front of the waltzers. Bull finally decided to let Mike and his 2 children go because it was Mike who told him about Gary and Gemma's affair in the first place. Mike did that because he still respected Bull. Bull goes to Gary and immediately puts a knife right between his legs. Gary looks so scared when he sees Bull. Bull then invites Gary to ride in a game arcade in order to interrogate Gary. In the middle of the game, Bull asks Gary about Norm and Gemma's whereabouts, but Gary lies by saying that he and Gemma separated 6 years ago, so he currently does not know where they are. Bull realized that Gary was lying, and without hesitation, he cut his vital organ, killing Gary on the spot. Bull has yet to find where Gemma and Norm are, but he's not giving up. Bull then goes into a nightclub, and at the club, he accidentally sees a drug courier. Bull then recalls that Gemma is a serious drug addict, so he quickly pulls the courier over to get the information about Gemma. Bull coerces the courier to bring him to a drug dealer. He believes that the dealer must know where Gemma is. The terrified courier is eventually forced to take Bull to the biggest drug dealer in the city. When he gets there, Bull politely asks him whether one of the dealer's customers is Gemma. The dealer then tells Bull that he will tell him if Bull gives him some money. Bull agrees to give the man the money, but before that, he asks for the drink the man is holding. Without even saying much, Bull slices off the man's hand and tortures him. The drug dealer looks in great pain. One of his hands is now gone. In the end, the man gives up and says he will drive Bull to Gemma's house on the condition that Bull lets him live. Bull finally arrived at Gemma's house. When he enters Gemma's house, he sees that she is sleeping. Bull then wakes Gemma up by shouting at her. Gemma is shocked to see Bull in front of her, and without a second thought, Gemma immediately apologizes and begs Bull to forgive her. Bull orders Gemma to call Norm to come and meet him immediately. Sometime later, Norm arrives with a gun ready in his hands. Armed, Norm walks into Gemma's house, and unbeknownst to him, Bull is ready with his knife right in front of him. Bull succeeds in knocking Norm down. After knocking Norm out, Bull grabs a pillow and smothers Norm's face with it. He sits on the pillow while asking Gemma about Aiden. Gemma keeps begging Bull to stop what he's doing, but Bull won't stop until Gemma tells him where Aiden is. In a fit of rage, Bull yells for Aiden, and in fear, Gemma tells him where Aiden is, who has apparently been dumped by Gemma and is currently living under a bridge in the center of town. Norm finally dies in front of Gemma's eyes, and Gemma is also shot dead by Bull. That night, Bull searches for Aiden under the bridge in the center of the city, and when he finds him, he takes him away from that place. Bull then decides to take Aiden to a nearby church. The next morning, a vicar arrives at the church. It turns out that the priestess is Bull's mother-in-law, Cheryl. Cheryl was divorced from Norm before Aiden was born. When Cheryl opens the church door, she is shocked to see Aiden lying unconscious on the floor. Her shock doesn't stop there. Bull's appearance leaves her more shocked and frightened. Cheryl knew that Bull had died 10 years ago. Cheryl then asks Bull's purpose for coming, and Bull says that he came to ask for salvation, not for himself but for Aiden. When we see Bull's all-black eyes, we learn that, in fact, 10 years ago, Bull actually died when Norm and his men burned him on the bus. Somehow, Bull suddenly rose from the dead to avenge him and save Aiden. Before leaving for good, Bull asks Cheryl to take good care of Aiden.